thank you all for coming. A few notes about museum programming before I introduce our speaker. So in June, we're working out the details, but our next lecture will be sort of about longevity and healthy aging, so stay tuned for more on that. Our regulars will know that we take a break in July and August. When we return with the lecture series in September, we will be having a panel discussion about suicide, so stay tuned for more details about that. And also, as I'm sure many of you know, and I mentioned last time, in October we are involved in Hub Week again this year. We're going to have 2 lectures, or I should say panel discussions here. One will be about the value of failure, which I think will be really special, and also a panel about anesthesia and consciousness, which I think will be fascinating as well. Just a housekeeping note before I introduce our speaker. After he is finished and after the Q&A is done, the bookshop here will be selling copies of his book directly underneath me here in the back of the museum, and then he'll be signing copies of the book. So all of that will be happening directly underneath us here. Dr. Joel Salinas got his MD at the University of Miami. He completed a neurology residency here and at the Brigham. He completed a research and clinical fellowship in behavioral neurology and neuropsychiatry here at Mass General, and he is an instructor of neurology at Harvard Medical School. He specializes in brain health, including neuropsychiatry and cognitive behavioral neurology, and he conducts research in social and behavioral epidemiology to understand the complex neurobiological interplay between social relationships and brain health. And his book, which just came out a couple weeks ago, the Kirkus Review's called Vicarious and Enthralling, and a rich, fascinating portrait of extraordinary sensory awareness. With that, let's welcome Dr. Salinas.
Everybody hear me okay? Good. Hi. Thank you for coming. With a show of hands, how many people here can't stand to see violent scenes in a movie? Or cringe when you see someone getting a shot at the doctor's office? And how many people here are the opposite, where you love the bloody, gory stuff? Different question now. How many of you, when you see your doctor, wish that you had more time with your doctor? Maybe because they spent most of the time looking at the computer screen and a couple times making eye contact. Yeah. And how many people here find that it's hard to empathize with people who are not in your immediate circle of friends and family? Or how many people are the opposite, where you feel that you're empathizing too much, constantly taking on the emotions and burdens of people around you? Yeah. So for the questions that I've asked, have you ever wondered why that is? Why is it that we cringe when we see somebody else getting hurt? Why is it so important that we connect with our doctors specifically and other people generally? Why is it that we have an easier time empathizing with people who physically look like us or who are related to us, and a harder time with people who we don't perceive as being related to us? And what if we lived in a world where the full force of empathy wasn't a choice per se, but an automatic function of our bodies? Today, I consider myself one of the luckiest people on the face of the earth. My presence here on this stage is pretty unlikely. It's been a bit of a journey. And no, I haven't won an Olympic gold medal, and I haven't won a Nobel Prize, but I feel very honored to be in the presence of all of you, to share this bit of time and to share this moment as community. It means a lot to me. And I'm committed to making sure that every second of it is worth it for you. This is only my 3rd time speaking in relation to my book, Meritage, so I'm still a little nervous, and my knees still shake a little bit, and I'm definitely sweating everywhere. Thank goodness for the coat. but seeing all of your lovely faces just fills me with so much joy. And not just joy for you coming here, but especially for your curiosity. I'm really looking forward to connecting with each of you, hearing your stories, and if you read Meritage, hearing what you think about the book. For those of you who I haven't met yet, my name is Joel Salinas. I'm a neurologist at Harvard Medical School, and being a neurologist means that I treat patients who have brain and nerve diseases. I do research and see patients at Massachusetts General Hospital, and while I am a medical doctor, calling me Joel is totally fine. As an overview of the time that we'll be spending together, I'll talk a little bit about myself, a little bit about the book, and then we'll have some time for questions later on. And then I'm really excited to sign books and meet you individually and answer any questions that you didn't get a chance to ask. So as I mentioned, I'm a doctor in neurology, and it's a field where empathy is paramount to be able to treat our patients adequately. But that doesn't always happen. Because of the burden of systemic time and administrative constraints, it creates a bit of a challenging environment for doctors to stop and deeply consider the emotions of those around them. For physicians in training, sometimes just to meet the demands of the job and meet minimum requirements of patient-doctor interactions, oftentimes they're encouraged to take on a sort of professional warmth that has an almost theatrical quality to it. It's this kind of smell of distraction is unmistakable. It's kind of like when you're in the room with someone who's there physically, but they're really not present. And in most cases, ultimately, I think this is a disservice to our patients. But what if I told you that crossing the empathetic threshold could happen involuntarily? Like a knee-jerk reflex for extreme empathy, or that it's possible to instantly recognize yourself in somebody else without even trying. For most of us, empathy begins with a willingness to understand and then perhaps feel what it's like to be in another person's shoes. This is especially challenging when you don't share much in common with the other person. You don't have that many shared experiences. Overcoming such a steep barrier takes time, patience, and a genuine desire to connect. And that's just the beginning. For me, however, in my brain, empathy happens in an unusual way. I literally feel the pain of others. I'm a polysynesthete, which means that I have multiple forms of what's called synesthesia. And through one of my forms of synesthesia, called Meritage synesthesia, my body physically feels what I see others experience on their bodies. Triggered automatically by sight, I feel a mirror touch on parts of my body that correspond visually to who I'm looking at, face to face. So your left, my right, your right, my left, like in a mirror. First off, can we all agree that synesthesia isn't the easiest word to spell or pronounce? Brain scientists are not doing any favors with that word. When I first learned about it, I was mispronouncing it all over the place. Synesthesia, Seizure, Synesthesia. And what's worse, in the United Kingdom, there's an extra A there in the middle there, so it's mispronounced Synesthesia. And then you add the word Meritage in front of synesthesia, and now you're just like, what the heck is this? It sounds like the name of a straight-to-DVD movie from a Stephen King novel. So as a brief appetizer, and if it's all right with you, I'd like to share a small kind of neuro-party platter of some of the mind-blowing things we've learned about synesthesia, but Meritage synesthesia specifically. So we're all on the same page. Our brain is made of cells. There are more cells in your brain than you can see stars in the sky. Each cell is connected to another brain cell essentially by a wire, and that's how these cells talk to each other. Now, synesthesia is a term that means the blending of the senses. It comes from the roots syn and aesthesia. Syn meaning together, anesthesia meaning sensation, so bringing sensations or senses together. Someone with synesthesia, called a synesthete, may experience colors with letters and numbers, colors with sounds, tastes with textures, and all sorts of strange and unexpected combinations. For me, for example, the word cat, the letter C is black, the letter A is red, and the letter T is red-orange. And altogether, my brain kind of perceives it as the word cat as a cloud of black with puffs of red and red-orange. Imaging studies show that in synesthetes, these sense areas of the brain seem to be more connected by these wires, and these sense areas tend to activate, be more active together. About 4 out of 100 people have some form of synesthesia, though more often than not they are found in artists and musicians. Examples include Stevie Wonder, Billy Joel, Eddie Van Halen, Tori Amos, Lord, Skrillex. There's tons of examples. Franz Liszt, for example, he conducted his orchestras asking for more violet tones. Vladimir Nabokov wrote about his colored alphabet, describing his letter S as a curious mixture of azure and mother of pearl. My S looks more like a yellow-orange kind of squash. Well, there are a few thoughts about what causes synesthesia. One of the most interesting things about it is that I think we're all born with synesthesia. At around age 2, it typically goes away. It seems like as we age, we are trimming the connections in our brain, almost like getting rid of streets to make way for a highway. And one of the thoughts is that synesthetes have defective pruning of those connections. So they have a lot of these excess connections left behind, so that way more areas tend to connect together. Another thought is that synesthetes have more active brain cells, or more excitable brain cells, and so they're constantly chatting with the cells around them, making all sorts of strange new connections. So for someone who sees colors with sound, for example, they may hear a sound. The hearing part of their brain will activate, but then also the vision part of their brain will activate, creating the simulation or the perception of color with sound. Now, what about vision and touch? So for all of us, when you look around, the vision part of your brain will activate. When you're touched, the touch part of your brain will activate. And one thing that scientists have discovered is that for all of us, when we see other people, especially when they're being touched or in pain, both the vision and the touch parts of our brain tend to activate. But that process tends to happen without us knowing it. It's kind of like your brain is creating a 3D virtual reality type simulation of the people around you. And one of the thoughts is that maybe this played an important role in the evolution of communication and language and being able to put yourself in the perspective of another person. Well, because of this kind of experience, we have almost like a secondhand touch. Sometimes it will cross a threshold into consciousness. So, for example, if you're seeing a football game and you saw someone suddenly get tackled, or someone fall on a bicycle and hit their face, that cringe that you get, well, that's that mirror neuron system involved. But for 2 out of every 100 people who have what's called mirror touch synesthesia, that mirror neuron activity not only is greater, but those brain areas are typically larger. And so that experience of that cringe is almost constant, all the time. And it might be because those vision and touch areas are more wired together, or they're more active together, but another part of it is that all of our brains have a part of it that is responsible for helping us tell the difference between our own bodies and the body of the people in front of us. And in these mirror touch synesthetes, what we find is that those brain areas typically are smaller and less active. So this mirror neuron system activity is even more active. It gets even weirder. This blurring of the brain's boundary between the self and the other can also be blurred for objects. Like in my case, where the boundary between me and anything not me is what's blurred. I imagine it's similar to that sense of oneness with the universe that people describe when they have a religious or mystical experience or in some kind of a drug-induced state. And I promise I don't use drugs. It's a kind of a hyper-Meritage synesthesia that's pretty rare. Rare enough that there isn't a formal name for it yet, but I'm pretty sure there are other cases out there. Because of my Meritage synesthesia, my brain automatically sees you, others, as a part of me. To the point that sometimes I actually have to focus on my own body so I don't confuse your feelings too much as my own, and so I don't forget about myself and my own feelings. Through Meritage synesthesia, I inhabit the bodily experiences of everyone around me all day, every day. So for example, as I walk through the revolving door of the hospital, I see an elderly woman sitting in a wheelchair. She's wearing a worn tweed coat. She has a knit cap on her head, and I feel the vinyl pressed against the back of my thigh. I'll feel the snug fit of her cap on my forehead. A volunteer stands behind her in the wheelchair, and his hip is jutted to the side. I feel the muscles in my hip contracted. I will feel the glasses, his glasses, on the bridge of my nose. As I walk by the security guard, I show my ID badge, and I'll feel the coiled plastic earpiece behind my left ear. As I walk to the main cafe of the hospital, I see doctors, nurses, administrators, patients, custodians, therapists. Each is a different channel. Each is a different collection of bodily experiences and sensations that my brain emulates in my own body as my eyes surf across them. I line up behind a mother carrying a baby. I feel the weight of the baby on my left shoulder. I feel the bob of her hair on the back of my neck. I feel the sway of my torso. She sways. I look at the baby. I feel the roundness in our faces. I feel the tiny clenching fists that we have. The baby smiles, and I feel the smile on my face. And then my own smile makes it real. Still, I'm one of the lucky ones with Meritage synesthesia. Meritage made me a better doctor once I learned how to harness this trait. Other Meritage synesthetes aren't able to really strike this kind of balance. A woman named Amanda, who has Meritage synesthesia, is so distraught by her Meritage synesthesia that she essentially became a shut-in, avoiding people altogether. She even refuses to own a dining room table in her home because she can't stand the sight of seeing other people eat. Others, while not housebound, require long periods of isolation to balance out these intense synesthetic experiences that often overwhelm them. Which makes me wonder how I was able to make it through years of intensive clinical training to become a neurologist, despite my brain mirroring so many people suffering from excruciating medical conditions and emergencies. Though my Meritage served me well professionally, I think. Recently, I was consulted to see a young woman with cerebral palsy. Because of her cerebral palsy, she can't speak. She woke up one morning in the hospital combative. She was swinging at her nurses and her nurses' aides, and they counseled me to come by and give a recommendation for medication to sedate her. I get to the floor. It's easy to find her room, because I hear the sounds of the moaning and the screeching. I get into the room, and I see her there. She is pushing on the bed railing, and with each push, the whole bed shakes. I feel the beads of sweat on her face. I feel the strands of mahogany hair stuck against my skin. I feel the burrowing of her brow. But then, there's something else that I can't shake. I feel, mirrored in my own body, a rising of my chest that's faster than my own breaths. I'm having a hard time actually keeping up with the sensation. And then, there's another mirrored sensation that's subtle, almost negligible. It's the feeling of my shoulder muscles activating. I'm not sure exactly why she's agitated, but I decide to take a chance and trust my body, trust this Meritage synesthesia, and order a special test. And the results come back. She has blood clots in her lungs. she wasn't just fighting because she was just delirious or angry, she was literally fighting for air. Without my Meritage synesthesia, I'm not so sure that I would have caught that at that point. With Meritage, my decision to work toward empathy is automatic, compulsory. Though it doesn't reveal itself in full, it does offer the potential for a more fully realized empathy. Existing in a neurologic replica of another person's sensory perceptions is as close as I can get to literally putting myself in the shoes of another person. It's up to me to walk the mile in front of me. If empathy is a person's capacity to feel and understand what it's like to be in the position of another person from their perspective, then Meritage represents a persistent, heightened state of empathy, a potential for a more fully realized form of empathy. It's up to me to reason through that experience so that I can then respond to my patients from a truer, more enduring place of compassion and kindness. Or I can respond with whatever else is needed. Sometimes that means prescribing a medication, though often it's simply just asking more questions, being curious about where another person is coming from and wondering why they might think, feel, or do what they do. Some situations are harder than others. Rare or unexpected situations make it almost impossible to differentiate between objective physical reality and my own internal subjective reality. In the hospital, when I examine a person or perform a procedure for the first time, the chances of experiencing the sensation or pain as if it were actually happening to me is substantially increased. During my neurology training, as I began to see patients with Tourette syndrome and tic disorders, for example, I distinctly remember one patient. He developed new self-mutilating tics in the setting of a lot of stress. He chews on the inside of his mouth, and he uses his knuckles to push against the corner of his lips so hard that his cheeks split apart like shredded beef. As I see him chew on the side of his mouth and grind his teeth with all his force, I feel a painful buzzing shooting through my left face, through to my teeth. It borders on hallucination. The more he pushes on his face, the more vivid the experience, the more vivid the pain. The Meritage sensations are constant, but in these instances, they pierce through my ability to filter, invading my perception of reality. My trait can blur the boundaries between myself and those around me to the point that I become inextricably entangled in others, their emotions, their needs, at the expense of losing myself in other people. For as far back as I can remember, information is constantly poured through my mind. Creating a mental filter for the sake of self-preservation may sound simple, but it's a dangerous means of survival. Filter too much, and I risk numbing my senses completely, and as a consequence, forfeiting my humanity, my ability to feel and empathize. Filter too little, and I risk submerging myself too deeply in another person, drowning in my senses and losing all sanity, all sense of myself. I think the risks are worth it, though. While each person uses his or her own remembered set of experiences and perceptions, their own set of lenses with which to view their internal and external worlds, this is exactly what makes empathy so challenging and so compelling. At its core, empathy seems to require an initial spark of desire to switch perspectives, to generously give another person's experience enough worth so that we're not only willing, but also yearn to see and live the world through that person's perspective. Meritage has been a harsh but just teacher. Since childhood, my trait has required an almost monastic dedication to the physical and mental labor of slowing down and filtering through the tides of sensory information, while preserving my dauntless, bloody pursuit of curiosity. Through my trait's many humbling and unexpected lessons, I've cultivated a greater awareness of our shared humanity, a deeper understanding of other people, and a truer sense of where we all begin and where we all end. Looking back, 2016 was a challenging year for so many of us. And for me, writing this book, Meritage, was one way of processing it all. This book is mostly a collection of personal, intimate stories of my life on my journey up to this point as a person and as a neurologist. And interwoven throughout, I share stories of patients and extraordinary people with atypical brains. These people, in one way or another, taught me about the brain, about how to live a fulfilling life, and about myself. My parents were born and raised in Nicaragua, though during the early 80s, they had to flee to the United States during the Nicaraguan Revolution, seeking political asylum. My parents had been born into families that were well off, but they lost everything and had to start over in a country that they knew little about. They worked so hard just to keep up. I distinctly remember as a kid, my father wakes up at 4 a.m. to deliver newspapers around South Florida. He comes home as the sun is beginning to rise. He puts on a brown UPS uniform and then delivers packages throughout Miami. As the sun begins to set, he comes home and he's drenched in sweat from the Miami sun. He takes a shower and then puts on a Domino's pizza outfit to go deliver pizzas throughout the night. Before this, he dreamed of being a marine biologist. Meanwhile, my mother, who had been in line to have a professional career in modeling in Nicaragua and dreamed of one day going to business school and opening a clothing store, was now working at a deli at a supermarket behind the counter. My parents taught me what it means to work hard for your family. They also left another unexpected impression. Whenever I see someone cleaning the streets, an office, a yard, somebody else's house, washing dishes at a diner, delivering mail, working behind a counter, I see my mom and dad. I can't help but feel like I'm seeing family. Growing up, we never really had a lot of money, but we had a lot of love. In short, love can't pay the bills, but what I learned from my parents was that love is what gives you a reason to pay them. Thinking back to my childhood, more than just being a very geeky kid of Nicaraguan immigrants, I'd always had a sense that there was something different or odd about me. And I always talked it up as just being a very weird kid. As a kid, I was very particular about the colors of my numbers and my letters. A has to be red, B has to be a slight orange, 1 has to be a bright yellow. As you can imagine, fussing over these things, my parents got very good at rolling their eyes, usually following up with something like, ay, Dios mío, oh my gosh. Watching television, and I watched a lot of television, I mirrored the contortions of the television world that I was immersed in. Seeing Roadrunner, he sticks out his tongue, I feel like a tongue is sticking out in my mouth. I see Wile E. Coyote get hit by a truck, I feel like I'm hit by a truck. I even had the opportunity to see what it felt like to be Dorothy from the Golden Worlds, patting my perm and throwing shade at Blanche for being Blanche. It was only until medical school that I actually learned that synesthesia was even a thing, let alone that my sensory experience was so different from other people. And during my first year of medical school, we went to India on a medical trip, and one night the group was talking about the health benefits of meditation. And a friend of mine who was a medical student and had a background in neuroscience happened to bring up the point that, oh, there's this group of people who see colors and sounds and tastes and words, and they have an easier time getting into these deep meditative states. And I was struck by him mentioning that, wondering, why would he even mention that? Everybody has that. Later that night, I confronted him about that, and I asked him directly, oh, you mentioned this thing about people who see colors and letters and numbers. What's so special? Everybody has that. And he just kind of looked at me and said, no. So after discovering about synesthesia, I began to learn a little bit more about it. And then a few years later, when I was being studied by one neuroscientist named V.S. Ramachandran and his graduate student at the time, David, they ran me through a whole battery of different tests and studies about synesthesia. As we were on a walk one day, they were asking me questions about the different forms of synesthesia that I had. And David, the graduate student, asked me, do you happen to have Meritage synesthesia? And I'd never heard of the term, so I asked him what it was, and he said, oh, it's when you feel touch in your body just by seeing touch on somebody else. And in my head, I was like, aha! You can't fool me this time. I know that everybody has a mirror neuron system, and we all simulate this. There's no way that I'm the only person that has this experience. So he said, here. So he ran his finger down the right side of his face, and he said, what do you feel? And I said, oh, a finger down the left of my face. He said, that's not normal. Since then, I've been able to learn more about Meritage synesthesia, and there's been a great deal of research done over the last decade, even though the first case of Meritage synesthesia was only reported in 2005. As I learned about Meritage synesthesia, I kept returning to a few lingering questions. Do Meritage synesthetes have a heightened sense of empathy? Do I? Dr. Michael Bannacy, who's a cognitive neuroscientist over at Goldsmiths, University of London, tried to answer this question by first validating every case of Meritage synesthesia that he saw experimentally, objectively, which is an important piece of scientific rigor, considering that synesthesia manifests itself in so many different ways, and empathy is such a squishy concept. Empathy is generally the process of understanding and or feeling the experience of another person, being mentally there with them. The process of empathy typically begins by noticing through your senses the experience of another person, then recognizing what that experience means based off of your own remembered experiences and reasoning what that might feel like, and then, and this is the challenging part, feeling that experience as if it were happening to you. So for empathy, we must notice, recognize, feel. There are two main types of empathy. Cognitive, or thinking empathy, involves reasoning through what it's like to be in the perspective of another person, while affective, or emotional empathy, involves experiencing the emotion that's close to what you're seeing in front of you, regardless of whether you've reasoned your way to it. In Dr. Bannacy's verified sample of Meritage synesthetes, he found that indeed Meritage synesthetes do have a heightened level of emotional empathy compared to non-synesthetes, though cognitive empathy levels were the same. This made intuitive sense to me, because the Meritage experience is largely embodied, and the trait's physical part might be more likely to create a strong emotional response to the experience of others. But what did this mean for me? I was beginning to have doubts about the practical significance of Meritage synesthesia. Was it just a quirk of my brain's wiring, or a pointless part of my body like an appendix, or an awkward tail? To truly know whether or not my Meritage synesthesia has a practical significance would probably have to be studied objectively, experimentally. But then, I reflected on my own experience, speaking from my own perspective, not as a scientist, but as a perfectly imperfect and biased and uncertain human being. I felt as though my Meritage synesthesia informed and bolstered what cognitive empathy I had. Though it's challenging to imagine what my cognitive empathy would be like without Meritage synesthesia, since it's been such a natural part of my way of sensing the world around me. To be able to understand another person's perspective with 100% accuracy would border on telepathy. And Meritage may not fit the standard form of telepathy found in science fiction. I think it helps to shine a light on those moments in the hospital where asking one more question, or the right question, can change a life. Even if it only benefits a single person in my lifetime, that alone will have made my Meritage completely worthwhile. And what about the experience of pain? As a Meritage synesthete, was I truly experiencing the pain of others? An echo of their pain? Or was it simply my brain's estimate of what that pain might be like? Given the phantom sensations I experienced, Meritage felt distant, yet similar to the pain that I experienced from stubbing my toe or slicing a finger. Self-perception of pain is a complicated subject. Any attempt to distill it to a digestible format leaves the nuances behind just to make way for pragmatic clarity. The more we engage in this art of distilling information, the more space we generously offer up for interpretation. And the questions that arise from this particular question of perceiving pain are somewhat personal, because I had to work through my own logical dilemmas and internal tensions about the subject. Initially, the researcher in me balked at the use of phrases like feels the exact pain of others to try to explain the phenomenon of mirror touch. After much deliberation, though, I eventually came to terms with this language. That said, pain is incredibly subjective. In the scientific study of pain, like empathy, it's typically measured via self-report, which is one of the most elemental tools of investigation, asking. There are tons of questionnaires that ask questions like, do you feel pain? Or, on a scale from 0 to 10, how much pain are you in right now? And the reason why that is that there really aren't any objective, reliable, valid studies like for pain like there are for blood pressure or cholesterol levels. Even when we try to find objective measures of pain using advanced imaging studies, all we see, using something like functional MRI, are the activation of brain areas that receive information related to touch and relay that information, as well as activation of brain areas that tag emotional significance to experiences like pain. What's even more fascinating is that even in people who have a genetic condition where they're insensitive to pain, their brain activation patterns for pain remain similar to everybody else. In one study of brain activity, persons who watched their spouse receive painful electrical shocks showed activation in their entire pain matrix. And I know you might be thinking, this might be a good opportunity, but no, I don't know how they got the informed consent for that study. But what they saw with these people is that when they saw someone who was not their spouse receiving painful electrical shocks, they had activation in this pain matrix as well, though not throughout the entire pattern. This possibly means that the most we can interpret objectively from either bodily injury, psychological distress, or observing the suffering of another person remains the after effects of pain, which are ultimately psychological, or at least, for the most part, remains in higher brain functions. As you can imagine, in the hospital, having mirror touch can be a bit of a challenge sometimes, but it also helps me help others. It's how I was drawn into medicine, and would help shape me as a doctor. Sharing the pain and suffering with others, they may feel a little less alone. And if you've ever been sick or known someone who was sick in the hospital, you know that that means a lot in medicine. It's my responsibility to then reason through that experience and respond in a way that helps, and in helping them feel better. Well, I get to be a part of that too. And sometimes it means a treatment, or simply showing respect, or being generous with my time, so I can listen with intention and really be present. On the flip side, mirror touch complicates my personal relationships. I'm wide open and vulnerable to taking on the darkest emotions and suffering of others as if they were my own. My mirror touch synesthesia extends my body map onto those that I love, those that I spend the most time with, and even when it's desperately needed, making it physically painful, excruciating to cut away. Though in the same vein, mirror touch synesthesia has taught me how to expand my world, to go beyond thinking what it's like to be in another person's shoes and literally feel what it's like to be in their shoes, recognizing and echoing their experiences to resonate with a heightened sense of empathy, and thus unlock a vast human capacity to follow it up with compassion and kindness and hope. As a kid, I started out avoiding the world, keeping myself closed in. And then, over time, as I slowly opened up, I became more and more attached to the experience of others, becoming too open for too long to extreme emotional empathy. And in the last few years, when it became clear that this extreme for too long was leading to what we call burnout, I had to work hard at learning how to create firm, yet thoughtful boundaries. And I had to learn how to balance every ounce of empathy in my body by building up in equal part my resilience through a disciplined daily practice, little daily habits of taking care of myself, being proactive with cultivating and stockpiling resilience beforehand rather than reactive after things hit the fan. And now, after a long list of hard lessons and much practice and sacrifice, I'm able to move myself more freely between both extremes. Being open to and experiencing many trials and many errors as I make my way through my journey, my trait has shaped me to feel more at ease with a brain that can make my body feel boundless, bestowing a sense of self which can exist in all things. And with this same expansive trait, I learned how to outline where I end and another person begins. Each sensory experience creates new memories, new opportunities, new connections between my neurons, all of which cause my brain to react cognitively, emotionally, physically, to engage in a deep personal exchange, a conversation with others in the world. One very powerful thing that scientists have discovered is that for most of us, this mirror neuron activity is greater the more we relate with whoever we're looking at. So if you were to see a video of yourself being touched or in pain, that mirror neuron activity would be greater than if you were seeing a friend or a family member in pain or being touched. That activity is the least when seeing somebody who you consider to be a stranger or foreign from you. While mirror touch synesthetes have an automatic ability to identify with another person's pain, empathy begins for most of us with a willingness to try and understand what it's like to be in another person's shoes. I think it's mind-blowing then that mirror touch synesthesia not only exists, but the entire range of empathy exists in all of us. This basic hardware for empathy is in all of our brains. And we can choose to engage it and, in the process, develop it. My hope with this book is that you would not only learn more about mirror touch synesthesia and how the brain works, but also learn more about how to develop your own heightened or engaged sense of empathy, to own it as a kind of superpower for yourself. Because you see, to me, radical empathy is not just more empathy, it's a more engaged empathy. Noticing, recognizing, feeling, asking, and responding. Sometimes responding can be as simple as just being curious, wondering why. Why another human being? Why another human being like me did what they did? Asking, why are they angry? Why are they happy or sad? Wondering, where are they coming from? What are their past experiences? It's not even necessary to have experienced the exact same situations that they've been through in their life. What's been seen in the research in empathy is that what is most important in determining your capacity for compassion is not how accurate you are in creating the simulation of another person's experience, it's how vivid that experience is. And we can always get help in that process by drawing on our past memories, our past experiences that may be similar. Or just close enough. Or imagining somebody else, a loved one, someone who we have even closer, and realizing that they may have had a similar situation in their life. I never imagined I would write a book. As far back as elementary school through college, I was always encouraged to pursue writing seriously, but that took a back seat when I got into medical school and into residency, so I could focus on more technical, scientific writing and on my clinical training. And then one day, after the research around synesthesia developed enough confidence and I became comfortable enough with it, I wanted to share my story and write about it. It's a story that I couldn't have told without synesthesia being in it. I remember when I was still staring at a blank screen and wondering to myself, I have no advanced formal training in writing. How am I supposed to write an entire book? But then I realized that throughout medical school and residency and my clinical training, I've been writing the entire time. I've written so many patient notes, reams and reams of patient notes. Enough patient notes to fill a small library. I also had a deep well of tragic and beautiful experiences to draw from. A mysterious tumor over my brain, how I survived a devastating 70-mile-an-hour car wreck, how I went on a wild expedition to the heart of the Amazon rainforest for the sake of research, and even a full-on dance-off with a voodoo shaman one night in Haiti. In fact, my very first rough draft, the draft manuscript, as it's called, was the length of 2 books. And now it's 1 book, Meritage. And I'll try not to give away too many spoilers, but as I was writing the book, it quickly became clear to me that the story was not just a reflection of me in my life, it was also inevitably a reflection of all the people who have helped shape me personally and professionally. Throughout, I share the stories of remarkable people with their atypical bodies and brains, many of them patients, and I go into some of the history and the most current research around each of them. I also highlight some of the research ways to increase empathy when it's too low, and when there's an extreme emotional empathy, how to cope with and prevent that from happening. In particular, burnout. It's really kind of a process of learning how to get empathy into a healthy green zone, if you will. To close, responsible members of the human species on this planet Earth know that the way in which we connect and interact with another is so important. We know that better social relationships are tied to better physical health, better brain function, including mental health, better well-being, greater sense of purpose, living a fulfilled life. We know that better relationships with our doctors are tied to better health, too. We know that the majority of us want better relationships, more emotional support, love, affection, someone available to listen to us when we need it most. We want to feel understood, acknowledge that we are valuable, that we are worthy, that we have been heard, that we have been seen, that we too exist on this planet as a member of the human species. Now, in your mind, allow yourself to tally all the people that you know right now who are socially isolated, who feel misunderstood, who others push away. Maybe because these isolated people are afraid of others, afraid of getting hurt, afraid of pain. Maybe they're angry, in fact, because they think that you have hurt them, or are going to hurt them, or a loved one. And now, again in your mind, allow yourself to tally all those that we here in this room push away in one way or another. Those that we avoid, that we insult, that we tap down to, that we lash out against because we are afraid of them, or afraid of what they have done, afraid of what we think they have done, afraid of what we think they will do. Notice how vivid we are willing to imagine those instances. Often so vivid that it might as well be happening right now. How willing we are to imagine that harm toward us, to envision that danger. Notice who or what pain we anchor them to in our mind. This won't be information coming from me. This will be information coming from you. This is information that can only come from you. We spend billions upon billions of dollars, create so many laws, devote entire state and federal agencies, all to protect our people, be it through military or developing drugs to cure medical illnesses, and rightfully so. But when a bridge collapses, we work to make bridges safer. When a contagious disease breaks out, we work to prevent its spread. We evolve to make communities safer, better. I ask us, all of us, to think about how we can get ourselves to change the way that we interact with others. Other members of our species, the others that we share this one planet Earth with, because they are us. They are us. Each big change that alters the course of history begins with a small, humble change in at least one person, ourselves. This is not something I could do by myself. I need you. We need you. And we need our close friends and family too. The only way we can befriend others is to be a friend first. The only way that we can move others is to move ourselves first. For me, this book, Meritage, represents that hope. I know that we can and must develop a heightened or engaged sense of empathy. Can you imagine? Really allow yourself to imagine what that would look like, what that world would look like if we didn't just think about what it was like to be in another person's shoes, but feel what it's like to be in another person's shoes. To then reason through that experience and respond from a truer, more enduring place with compassion and kindness. Thank you. So we'll open it up for questions.
Yes. What led you or other physicians to look at your brain and find the tumor? Is the first part of my question. And the second part is, did your ability to process change after however you had the tumor treated, removed the chemo, or...
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm so impressed.
Thank you. So the first question is, what led to discover the tumor over my brain? So I was actually doing a medical trip out in Haiti when I was in medical school, and while I was there, I developed a sharp headache over the right side of my head, and over that same area there was a divot also in my skull. And as I'm touching this divot in my head, it's really painful, and it hurts even more when I bend forward. So as all medical students have this innate fear of every medical illness happening. So we actually happened to have a great neurosurgeon on the trip, and I happened to kind of casually walk up to him and tried to ask him, kind of just saying, "Oh, what happens when a patient develops a sudden headache out of nowhere?" And he kind of looks down his glasses and he says, "Usually means they're going to die." That was concerning. But when I told him that it was me that I was talking about, he said, "Oh, we'll take a look at it when we get back to Miami." And when we went back to Miami, he was so kind. He had his two kind of administrative assistants, his right and left hands, walk me through the whole hospital and do all the tests that I needed to have done. And it turned out that it wasn't what he thought it was going to be. And so he referred me to a specialist, and we wanted to follow it, and actually ended up growing. And then we ended up having to do an excisional biopsy to figure out what it was. And thank goodness it ended up being benign. And it didn't involve my brain, though there was a lot of concern based off of the initial imaging that maybe it actually involved some of the blood vessels right over the brain, and a lot of the thoughts about it were that it actually might have been malignant. But a lot of this I didn't find out until after I had it removed from medical students that were like my co-medical students who were doing rotations across the hospital, who were able to relay information back to me. And one of the concerns that I had with the surgery was, will it affect the synesthesia? So one of the thoughts is, so the type of tumor that I had blood vessels tied to it, which wasn't clear at the start of trying to figure it out. And later on, it was actually one of the researchers that I worked with during a research fellowship that it did, is that maybe that there was some differential effect on the development of my brain because of the blood vessels over the area or whatever. But for me, kind of going through the surgery, I was actually really frightened that I was going to lose this synesthesia because it was intrinsic to who I was. It'd be like losing a sense of sight. And so when I woke up from anesthesia after the surgery, the first thing I looked for was letters, just to see if there were still colors there. And there were, thank goodness. It didn't change either, so that was also really nice. Synesthesia typically stays stable throughout the lifetime. Some of the specifics of the associations will change depending on the context and kind of how emotional states and kind of how awake you are and all sorts of things. One of the thoughts is that it does change with age, just like the brain changes overall with age. So they kind of track together. That was a great question.
Thank you, amazing. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Over here.
Does that ever change with how the other person thinks about you? Like if you know someone dislikes you, and and they are going through some kind of pain, will you still be empathetic or like?
Yeah. So the question is, what if the person doesn't like me? Will I still be empathetic? So I think that's one of the things that's really fascinating about this Meritage synesthesia is that it's agnostic to the person. It's just the sensory information that my brain is receiving automatically puts me into the shoes of the other person. So I don't have a choice in the matter, whether or not I kind of put myself in there. And because of that, I find that I'm much more willing to try and explore what that experience is like. I mean, it certainly feels really uncomfortable when someone's really angry at me and they dislike me because it's reflected back at me. It's like I'm very angry and upset at myself. And so through a lot of my life, I've had to kind of really figure through, okay, what are these feelings that I'm experiencing right now? Is it grounded in anything reasonable? And what can I do about the situation now to make it better? It's almost like a compulsory mindfulness. Like you're kind of forced to have to kind of sort through each piece of information so that way you don't kind of get enveloped in all of it. But I feel like it's really helped me a lot, but that's something that I couldn't really say early on in my life. It took a while to really get to that point. Over here?
I'd be interested to find out how many in the room have some form of synesthesia.
Oh, that's a great question. With a show of hands, does anybody here have any form of synesthesia? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's great. If there's about 100 people here, that's still about 4 in 100, so that makes sense. And
I don't know what I have, but I think some image pops up in my head when you say some words. So every word has an image within it.
Yeah. Synesthesia is a weird phenotype, meaning how can these traits express themselves. I like to think of it like this kind of synesthetic brain or this synesthetic way of perceiving the world exists on a spectrum. And whether or not we call it synesthesia or not is kind of a term or a label that we decide as a group or for research to just give it that label. It's kind of like height, for example. You can be any height, but we choose to say that some people are tall and some people are short. Right over here?
Do you ever get overstimulated, like if you're in a rock concert, or are there things you can't do because your synesthetic perception of sound, like a rock concert could be like a acid trip or something?
Yeah. Well, so the question is, there are certain situations where I'm overwhelmed by my senses, and I think the one thing that's interesting you mentioned was this acid trip. So LSD acts on serotonin type 2A receptors. And one of the thoughts is actually that in synesthesia there may be an upregulation of this same receptor because the experiences are actually quite similar. And sometimes what I'll describe the experience is like Silicon Valley grade LSD, like a homeopathic dose of LSD. There are certain situations that can be very overwhelming, but I try to be very cognizant of kind of like I mentioned, like the resilience piece of it, like to be even more concrete. I have like a checklist like I had for my patients in residency. It's like checkbox 1, am I sleeping well? Checkbox 2, am I eating? Am I drinking water? Am I moody right now? Do I need time to myself? And I try not to avoid too many situations because I think there's something to be gained out of uncomfortable situations. And kind of the words of Joseph Campbell, in the cave you fear to enter is where the treasure lies. And that's kind of a lesson that I learned from my parents, was there's something that makes you uncomfortable that you're afraid of, do it. And because of it, I think that's one of the reasons why I felt as comfortable as I did to go into medicine. Whenever I saw something really, really horrific or really uncomfortable, I said, pay attention. Don't forget this. And the more I kind of exposed myself, the easier it was to manage the experience later on, but it also helped me appreciate kind of the patient's experience a lot more.
How do you react to conditions that are the opposite of your experience? For example, I'm on the autism spectrum. So I'm listening to you exhorting me to show more empathy, feel what other people are feeling. And I'm thinking like, yeah, wouldn't that be nice? And I'm sure that there are other conditions, certainly in the psychiatric area, people who, sociopathy or things like that. I mean, where things are just missing that you take for granted.
Yeah.
Does that make you more interested in those types of cases? Does that make it more difficult for you to relate?
And so the question being, how do I react or respond to those that are on the opposite end of that spectrum of empathy? And you know, I'm acutely sensitive to kind of the importance of neurodiversity and being neurodiverse myself. And one of the things that we know about empathy, at least, is that, and in particular, the experience or the kind of the processing of both the vision leading to activation of touch areas in the brain, one of the words that's used to describe it is called visual tactile perception. And what we know is that there's two components to building into that visual tactile perception. One is kind of your hardwiring, kind of like what are you born with? What is your brain wiring like? And the other component is a willingness to engage in that experience. So that kind of wiring aspect of it, it's actually quite fascinating because it ties to kind of the sense of bodily agency, kind of how much you think you have control over your own body, and also kind of the fluidity of your bodily sense of awareness. And we know that in multiple, I don't want to call them disorders necessarily, but some of them fall under kind of DSM disorders, so like anorexia nervosa. There's actually a greater sense of bodily kind of fluidity to it, which may also explain why there's kind of this body dysmorphia that goes into it. And also people have what's called alexithymia, the inability to kind of perceive your own internal emotional states. That has to do with kind of your ability to perceive kind of where your body is in space and whether your heart rate is racing. So that's just kind of the harder piece. The willingness part of it, I think, is something that could be developed in that it's part of neural circuitry, and our brains are very plastic. We're constantly making new connections, and so the more you engage in the experience, the more likely you are to reinforce that circuitry. Now, am I saying that everybody has to be extremely empathic? I don't think so. I think it's worth being more engaged in the process, though. I think it's helpful in kind of a society where we're interacting with the other people. I think the onus to be empathetic is kind of a call more to just kind of like a kindness to the people around you, just to be kind to other people. I don't think it needs to be mandatory. I just think it's something that's important to kind of help the people around you feel better. And one of the things I think is really fascinating about social network research is that we find that emotional states and health travel through social networks like a contagion. So the happier people are around you, the happier the people around them are as well. And so kind of in an environment where you're constantly bombarded with these images of how the world is coming to an end, and all these horrible things are happening for people that are miles away, for somebody who's empathetic, that's painful because all you do is suffer, really, you can't do anything about it. To me, at least, I feel that the call to be kind to the people around you is even greater in those situations, knowing that if I'm kind to like my server at the restaurant or the person who helps me, or if I'm kind to the nurses, they'll be kind to other people, and kind of like contagion will eventually reach that person. Certainly being politically active is important and being aware, but I think doing what you can now helps you be a little bit more empowered rather than kind of have this paralysis about not being able to do anything about it. Because there is always something you can do, you just won't necessarily see it at that moment.
I think you said that everyone was born with synesthesia. I think you said that everyone was born with synesthesia, and around 2 years old or so it goes away for most. Is there any research as to what makes it stay for those people who continue to have it?
Yeah, so that work was done, so the question is there a reason why those connections tend to stay in people who have synesthesia? So that work comes from Daphne Maurer at McMaster University, and she did a lot of child development work, and I feel like child development work is like always so adorable. Because you have these kids with like these EEG caps, and they just plop them on a table and like show toys and things. And so what they found with those kids was whenever you show them either a large black ball or a small white ball and you play a sound, whenever you play a high-pitched sound, they will almost always look to the small white ball, and whenever you play a low-pitched sound, they will always look at the large black ball. And whether that kind of the persistence of those connections has to do with genetics, I think has yet to be determined with a lot of certainty, but that's kind of the thought process, that potentially it has some kind of heritability to it. Because if you have synesthesia, there's a good chance that somebody else in your family has synesthesia. And there's actually a lot of overlaps with autistic spectrum disorders. In particular with the sensory experience in autism, you will, there's a lot of similarity in what people will describe between both of them. And actually, in studies looking at genetic linkages, you actually find that in people who have synesthesia in general, it falls on chromosomes and genes that are more often found in autistic spectrum disorders. You actually also, in people who have autism, you find you see more synesthesia in that group than you see in the general population.
This is a really practical question. I don't need the microphone. I think everybody can hear me. One of the first questions you ask us is who wants to spend more time with their doctor? And I think most of our hands went up. How do you deal with that? Because you're not totally in control as a doctor.
That's right. Yeah. So the question is, how do I manage this kind of lack of time? That is so challenging, and it's totally dependent on the context that you're in. So I'm acutely aware during the time that you're a medical student and a resident, your time constraint is even shorter because you're still learning. And at the same time, you have to present to an attending who can be very intimidating, and they're expecting you to know everything about this patient, their whole life story, at the drop of a hat, and you have to present it with enough confidence that it's like you've not only put together a play, but you've also rehearsed it, and you're ready to for a debut. And if you get anything wrong, in the attending's mind, it'll possibly look bad on evaluation, which will affect kind of your career going forward. So it becomes problematic. And so as a resident or a medical student, you're actually incentivized to hurry up, look at the computer, get all the data, and then just this happens a lot in psychiatry because a lot of diagnoses are kind of like a set of checkboxes. And as part of becoming a psychiatrist, you move away from those checkboxes, but early in the training, you're like, okay, enough sleep, appetite, guilty, and you just go through that checkboxes, and as a resident, you want to hurry up. You need to get out before your attending starts to knock on your door. Now that I'm no longer a fellow or a resident, I do have a lot more liberty with my time, and it's been great to have that. There's a balance certainly between the constraints of the system and the time, and so what I try to do is determine what is needed at that moment. So for example, if there's an urgent situation, even like an emergency, there's no time to be empathetic there. And being more empathetic may not necessarily be useful. Like at that point, you want to be like a machine and algorithmic and just move down the algorithm as quickly as you can. But there are some times where the person really needs that connection, where you can really see on their faces that they just need someone to hear them talk. And in those times, I turn the computer to the side and I say, what's really going on? And listen, and sometimes it's just as easy as just saying, how can I help? Because most of the time the patients don't want to talk about, like what their diet is or this or that. They just want, the issue that they have is like, I have a bad back, or I'm not sleeping well, or this blood pressure medication makes me feel really bad. Can we change it?
Maybe 2 more questions.
I have 2 comments and a question. First of all, your parents must be very proud. And another comment, it goes towards what you were saying, which I think I've worked in healthcare for 21 years, and if you have 5 minutes and you're engaged and truly genuine, I think, versus distracted and not really there, that, like you're saying, actually is perceived by the patient and makes more of a difference than the actual total chronological time. And my question is, I don't claim to be one of the 5%, but I definitely have a little bit too much empathy at times, and I do mindfulness meditation and the whole working on it. And I try to make a ripple effect, and my question is, how do you deal with people who seem to be as was mentioned before, almost completely non-empathetic and work with them and try to be okay with that. For instance, they just point blank judge and critique and compartmentalize versus just having a little more understanding, even if they don't understand where that person's coming from or been through. It's hard to be around that.
Yeah. So the question is how to manage these like really challenging people. How to deal with someone who's rude. to put it bluntly. I wish I had a one-word answer to that, but the truth is it involves a bit of self-work to be able to be in those situations. It's like how to withstand a really uncomfortable place, like sitting on attack. Part of it is kind of what I mentioned, setting these firm yet thoughtful boundaries, and I'm very deliberate when I say yet thoughtful, because you want to shut out the world, but just knowing that there's certain times when, this isn't about you. This is about them. This is their thing. Let them do what they need to do, and just let it kind of wash over you and let it pass. The other part of it is the resilience aspect of it that I mentioned, because when it happens, the more of a store of resilience you have, it's the more buffer you have to the world around you, and like that mindfulness meditation, that helps a lot, because it helps to engage those that neural circuitry that helps regulate your own emotions and your own behaviors, so that way when somebody does something, you'll feel the rise. I mean, just know that it's okay to feel angry and upset, like that's going to happen, but then it's what you do with that feeling that really matters. Do you engage it and let yourself get totally flustered, or do you say, okay, that is really upsetting because what they said is hurtful. What do I do now? Sometimes it's just kind of addressing their concerns and moving on. Sometimes it's just ignoring them completely. I think those are some of the key things, and realizing that you don't necessarily have control over how they experience the world, what their past experience are. I mean, they could have just lost somebody the day before, and that's why they're having that horrible experience and they're acting out. So you don't know, but you do have control over your emotional response to the situation. Right here.
Hi, I'm going to read off here so I don't mess it up. Do you see lack of awareness of synesthesia as a problem, in the general population, maybe even clinical situations? People like Ramachandran, you mentioned, have made people more aware of it. They're much more receptive of the idea. Like if you had said this maybe 20 years ago, 40 years ago, people would have thought you were just kind of crazy. Are people becoming socially isolated or marginalized, not just because they're overwhelmed with information that they get, but because either they don't articulate their description sufficiently to other people, so they sound a little goofy when they try to describe it, basically, or because they actually are ready to accept or offer explanations that are overly fanciful, perhaps, and so they're becoming misinterpreted, misunderstood, sometimes with maybe catastrophic results. Are people being misdiagnosed as potentially, I don't know if schizophrenia is that's kind of far out there maybe, but or depersonalization. So when I was in college, this was 20 years ago, so I have mild synesthesia, I would say. I have graphene synesthesia, mild mirror. It's more of a visual tactile, I wouldn't call it Meritage.
Yeah.
But people I find very dismissive of it. There are people that I've talked to who also have it, who aren't. They're more willing to accept the sort of the new agey explanations for their they're not in the scientific fields, and they're becoming somewhat marginalized, I feel, from this, or potentially medicated or misdiagnosed with depression. Maybe people think they're autistic. Like when I was a child, I was tested for autism because people thought there was something really wrong. So I don't. How do you see that? Where do you see that going? Like in the future, do you see it becoming something that people are more aware of? The general population is more aware of. And people in powerful positions, medical positions, where they can really drastically change somebody's life for the worse by offering them a catastrophic explanation for what they're experiencing.
Yeah. So, to repeat the question, how to manage whether or not to be more open about synesthesia and whether being more aware of synesthesia, kind of what are the implications clinically for a person and where I see that going. Speaking from personal experience, I think And this is something actually that I've also heard a lot of other synesthetes say, is that first just having a name for it is really helpful, especially if you found that you were kind of isolated because you weren't really sure why you were so weird. And the other piece is it gives you an opportunity to learn more about it and get a better sense. Like, you know, we always talk about know thyself, and for me, kind of knowing thyself meant like learning about the brain and learning how I perceive the world around me. I didn't really talk much about, I wasn't very open about it until I felt comfortable with the research around it. And what's really fascinating is that some of the work around visual tactile perception and Meritage synesthesia and synesthesia in general is better than most of the other functional MRI data that gets touted in the media quite often. So that added up enough confidence that I was more comfortable to talk about it. And for me, it was like a second coming out, where I was like really unsure how people were going to respond. And it, I mean, as a medical student and as a resident, I didn't want to be discredited. I wanted to save my reputation as much as I could. So I didn't really talk about it unless I really was confident that someone was going to be cool with it. And then as I got more confident, I spoke about it more and then realized that most people were okay with it, or they kind of understood where I was coming from, and they were open to hearing a little bit more about the research. I think as more people talk about it, I think it'll become kind of like a household term, essentially. And it's fascinating. It's something that people want to learn about, and I think having an opportunity to talk about it with people who want to hear about it works out really well. And there's certain times, I mean, and I'll kind of pair this with coming up the first time for me, that you also want to be conscious of how the other person will likely react. If like someone is very weirded out from things coming out of their comfort zone, you don't necessarily want to be very forward about that information unless it's totally critical and relevant to the situation at hand. I think clinically the relevance to it, and this is something that I've been seeing more recently because I'm getting a lot of questions from parents and people about kind of what to do and kind of how to interpret kind of the synesthetic experiences. And kind of my sense of it is that it, you know, I don't see it as a disorder or a condition. I see it as a neurologic trait, just like seeing and hearing, things that, you know, some of us can use as a strength or a vulnerability. Like some of us are really good at learning musical instruments or languages, while some of us can't do math and like crush under the pressure of like figuring out tax or tip on a restaurant bill. But there's other aspects of it that can make the experience more distressing for others, and oftentimes it's things like depression or anxiety, or there may be something else that's been undiagnosed. Whether or not to consider it like psychosis or early signs of schizophrenia, I think if you're in the age range for schizophrenia, I think it's important to keep that in mind, where if you're reacting to internal stimuli a lot, and that actually may be a hallucination, and to then have a more serious conversation with a psychiatrist.
Well, I mean, so my question in regard to that was more on the lines of, say you have like just an average person, like someone who's not in the top 5% or top 10 percentile, or just, you know, average high school kid, and they're just explaining what they think. Well, maybe at that point, maybe they know that other people don't experience this. They come up with an explanation that is perhaps a bit fanciful, but they're not psychotic. But they're saying these things to people that might lead people in medical positions to maybe misdiagnose them and medicate them for this.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that it's good to share what synesthesia is to others, so that way it's less likely to be considered like some terrible diagnosis or something really, really horrifying for someone to have to go through. Yeah, I think it's something that, that we're talking about it would actually be helpful. Thank you so much.